So at UCs, it's around 35 to 40% of folks live on campus. At CSUs, it's just 11%. And at community colleges, this one's the one that really shocks me. It's just 14 out of 116 campuses that have any housing at all. So there's a huge, incredible demand for student housing. And particularly when it comes to really just all of our colleges and universities in the state and have incredibly high prices. And those student populations are constantly growing. So there's always an appetite for more density and more just rental units in general. UCs and CSUs have land use authority in California. So if they own or long-term lease a piece of land, they are not subject to any local zoning or any local ordinances. They can just build whatever they want on those properties, of course, subject to state safety standards. So if you're a developer and say you have a parcel of land that's zoned for sort of low density, if you're partnering with a university on that project, you can have unlimited height, unlimited density, because you're not subject to any of those local zoning standards. So that is a huge opportunity for projects that maybe wouldn't have penciled under local regulations to now pencil. And you're also providing a lot more housing to a lot more students in need. 20 to 25% of community college students are experiencing homelessness within a given year. So we simply cannot argue that there is no demand for student housing at community colleges.
Zoning policies in our cities in California, most of that land is zoned for single family use. So around UCs, CSUs, and community colleges, about 50% of the land is zoned for single family and around 15% is zoned for multifamily. Another thing we looked at was just the cost of housing around campuses. So we looked at the off-campus housing costs around every UC, CSU, and the 15 largest community colleges. And what we found is that the cost of housing in most cases for students is actually greater than the cost of tuition. And we definitely think we need more housing around transit stops. If you have a metro line, if you have a major bus line, that's where we want folks to be able to live. It's a lot easier for them to be able to access that public transit to get to work and all the places they need to be. And so we think a lot of those arguments apply to student housing as well. We want students, we want professors, we want staff to be able to live, to work, and to learn all within walking distance of their campus communities. And so even if a city says we don't really want housing there, we would rather this be a target, we say as the Student Homes Coalition, as a lot of students across the state, we actually think there should be an opportunity for new housing development, even if the lot is zoned for commercial use. And then they can build through a streamlined process on these commercially zoned lots within half a mile of it.
Okay, welcome to another episode of Affordable Housing and Real Estate Investing. Guys, today we're going to cover a topic that not a lot of people talk about. And I have Kate Rodgers on with Ryan Lenney, and they're from the Student Homes Coalition, Oregon, California. And what they're working on is really interesting, right? Trying to create the zoning changes to impact the communities around a lot of the universities that's around here. I mean, just think about it. When I was a student, I had problems looking for off-campus housing, to be honest with you. And that's a problem that not only students can relate to, but probably parents too, right? So today, I want to show you a career path that not a lot of people knew about in college. But hey, without getting further into it, ladies first, Kate Rodgers, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today?
Good. Thank you so much for having us. Like you said, my name is Kate. I'm the co-chair and policy director of the Student Homes Coalition. I'm originally from LA. I went to UCLA. I'm actually technically still a student at UCLA, so just one quarter left, but already kind of getting a little bit ahead of myself on the career. But yeah, I'm up here in Sacramento doing lobbying full-time for the Student Homes Coalition.
Well, Kate, give me just a little bit more color about how did you end up in this career path? And what blows my mind is that you're technically still a student. So this makes it so much more attainable as a career for like other people that might be looking to make an impact. So tell us a little bit more about that.
Sure. So I actually started doing legislative advocacy when I was a freshman in college. I found through some friends, mutual friends, a spot at this youth-led policy organization here in California called Generation Up. It's actually the largest sort of entirely student-run policy advocacy organization in California. And through that, I got involved in higher education policy, specifically focusing on like mostly Title IX issues. And about a year and a half ago now was when I met Ryan, when Ryan joined Gen Up, and he really brought housing issues to sort of the forefront of my mind, right? Because when you're in higher education advocacy, a lot of the conversation is dominated by college affordability. But what we all kind of noticed was that left out of this conversation was housing, despite the fact that housing is the largest non-tuition cost of attendance, and it's often the largest share of cost of attendance, right? So through that, got involved in housing advocacy through the Student Homes Coalition, and now here we are, right? I'm co-chairs with Ryan, have made a career out of it, which I'm really, really passionate about and really excited to be sort of spending my life doing. And I'll say to anybody who's in college or in high school and looking to get involved, I would just say, like, look for those opportunities where they present themselves, whether it's a volunteer opportunity or an internship. I think getting experience and getting your feet wet and really figuring out if it's right for you, and also gaining those connections to help you really establish yourself, is like the best way to go. That's what Ryan and I did, and here we are now, right? So yeah, I would say that's how I got involved.
And was there a problem or a story that made you particularly like motivated? Because you talked about Gen Up, you talked about Title IX issues. Was there like a story that like propelled you forward towards like making this sort of your career choice in the beginning of your career to advocate for some of these issues, especially in the higher ed? Like, tell us, was there a story or something like that that we need to know about?
Yeah, I mean, I think with housing in particular, I actually joined the Student Homes Coalition to work on a specific bill. That bill was AB 2801, which provided protections around security deposits for students. And or not for students, but just for anybody. But this is a huge issue for students. And I think for me, it was just very much informed by my personal experience of housing at UCLA. If anybody is familiar with the Westwood area, it's incredibly expensive. It's one of the most expensive areas in all of LA. And I was paying really unaffordable rent in my junior year to live packed like sardines with a bunch of other students in a tiny apartment. And I was told by everybody around me, like, oh, yeah, your landlord, they're just going to rip you off. They're going to take your security deposit. They're going to fine you for all of this random stuff that seems unfair, but whatever, you just got to deal with it. And since I had a policy background already a little bit through Gen Up and through sort of meeting Ryan and being a little bit exposed to housing issues at that time, I was like, that seems fishy to me. I'm going to do a little more research. And I kind of looked into it, and I found this bill through one of my good friends who used to work in the California legislature. And we decided to work together, sort of put our collective minds behind it. And we ended up with a really great bill that the governor signed in 2024, which we're really proud of. And kind of through that, I started getting involved in the Homes Coalition. And I started to get a little bit more background on land use policy, housing finance, overregulation, and streamlining, and all of these sort of major policy areas that we have in housing. And really sort of leaned into that because I realized over time that, like, I want to be in a field where I'm maximizing my output, right? I want to do as best good as I can. And I think it's pretty clear, just given all the challenges facing California today, that housing is sort of the most important issue. It's the most central to people's lives, and housing affordability is sort of the key to everything. When you think about higher education, it's the key to being able to complete your education and move on and develop a career and become financially stable, right? So I felt like, if I'm going to want to make the most impact that I can, I have to work in housing. And that's how I ended up at student homes.
Ooh, that is such a great hallmark of a great leader because you saw what was happening to your fellow students at UCL in the Westwood area. You were, in fact, just told, like, hey, this is what's going to happen. You just have to accept it. And you said, no, that doesn't really make much sense. Then you got a bill passed. This is so freaking cool. I'm so geeking out over this. And Ryan, I'm going to come to you next. But what was that bill that you did, Kate? Like, what was the impact of that bill?
Sure. So that bill was AB 2801, authored by Assemblymember Laura Friedman. And Laura Friedman has now moved on to Congress, but she was a great pro-housing legislator here in California. So definitely loved working with her, always loved working with her and her team. But that bill essentially required that, well, I guess just to back up, to give a little bit of background information. Everybody knows, right, that when you rent an apartment or a house, you pay your security deposit, and the idea is at the end of that lease, whatever damages, say, were created by your tenancy are repaired, and then they give you the rest of the money back, right? I think we all sort of understand that that's how it's supposed to work. And in a lot of cases, that's how it does work. And a lot of landlords are doing their best to honor that. But there are definitely a lot of bad actors that are instead just taking all of the money and then saying, oh, well, you broke this, and this, even when you didn't. Or they're saying, those blinds aren't broken, but I'd really love to buy some new ones. So I'm just going to use your security deposit, even though you didn't cause any damage to the property, right? So what we did with AB 2801 was close a lot of those loopholes by providing a more sort of, I guess, shifting some of that burden onto the landlord to prove that they actually used your money for a specific and legitimate cause under the sort of outlines of what the security deposit should be. So we actually didn't really bring any new legal standards in, but we essentially requiring now that landlords actually abide by the idea of what the law, like kind of the spirit of the law, what it already was. So, and the impact of this is honestly, it can be huge for certain tenants. I know that if you're sort of more well off, you might think, okay, security deposit is not that big of a deal, right? But for a lot of folks where cash is a little bit more tight or they're rent burdened and they're already under financial stress, having that $2,000, $3,000 just be gone when they should have it makes it incredibly hard to even move to a new apartment, because you need that cash to, say, pay your next security deposit or pay your first and last rent for your new apartment, right? So having that money, especially for young people like students who are looking to, say, move after they find a job, the last thing we want is for students to find a job in a new city and not be able to afford to go there because they literally don't have enough cash in the bank to put down first month's rent, right? So we're really trying to make sure that students and young people and just low income people in general have that financial freedom to be able to have the money that is rightfully theirs and use that to be able to move around, even just put food on the table in a lot of cases. So yeah, really, really proud of the work on that bill.
Wow, way to go. I can totally relate to that stuff. I mean, I've rented in LA before in a West Hollywood area where when I was moving out, they even did a walkthrough, but they still claimed I had all this damage, even though the person signed off on it. And I was like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
And I've had friends that have $10,000 looking for an apartment in LA, and they had to put down first like security deposit for one just to apply to one. And all of a sudden, after you apply to 2 or 3 apartments, you're essentially homeless because now you're waiting to get your money back before you can apply to the next apartment.
Yeah.
And I don't think this is, sometimes people are in this little bubble and they don't recognize the wider issue that's at play. So, oh, this is so good. I'm so pumped for this conversation right now. You have no idea. I'm so jazzed. But all right, Ryan, let's bring you in. How did you get involved in this career path?
I think that while Kate started from a place of having some of these skills in higher education advocacy and kind of knowing the avenues to make an impact across the state, I very much did not when I got started with housing policy work. I was in my sophomore year of high school, and a few of my friends where I attended high school here in Orange County were experiencing homelessness. Their families just came upon hard times, and it's harder to find a new job, and they couldn't make rent. And just like that, they were sleeping in their minivan in our local grocery store parking lot. And I come from a family of social work. My mom and sister are social workers. And so I know about a lot of programs meant to help get people get by, and started looking into them to see if there was anything that could help my friends. And came to find out that the waiting list for affordable housing in Orange County, I think currently is 10 years long and is closed. It's not accepting any new applicants. So that's when I decided that I wanted to try to do more in this space. And I started off volunteering at a homeless shelter, just trying to do some direct service, but met a lot of other folks there who felt like that wasn't enough, that we wanted to try to address some of these more systemic issues that are leading to there not being enough affordable housing and housing more generally. And so I helped start a little advocacy group here in Orange County, just kind of showing up to city council and planning commission meetings, speaking in favor of new mixed income or affordable housing developments, and hopefully provide a bit of a counterweight to a lot of the other folks in our community who show up and say, we don't want those type of people here, or we just don't want to see cranes or trucks or any sort of development in our community. And After doing that for a couple of years, I went off to college, and that's where I met Kate and some other students doing this higher education advocacy work. And from the get-go, I immediately thought, like, this could be a great way to try to get more students working on housing issues. And so that was back in the winter of 2022. And in 2023, we worked on our first statewide student housing bill. It was AB 1630. It was a bill that was going to pretty significantly upzone all the land within 1,000 feet of any college or university in California. And we were still sort of getting our bearings straight in terms of this statewide housing advocacy, and didn't get very far with that bill. Then thankfully, Kate came into the fold and had a lot more expertise in just how to kind of work within the legislative system in California. And we came back the next year with a few more policies. Kate spoke to one of them. I'm happy to go into more details on some of the others, but we were able to successfully get a few of those bills passed into law, and have a few more now that we're working on this year as well.
Ooh, okay. I loved your story about, and thank you for sharing how long the wait list is in Orange County. Where I grew up, when my mom was looking for affordable housing, that wait, I mean, when I left that apartment, it was like 7 years. And when I went back to help another local housing authority, just think about, hey, how do we get you more affordable housing? They told me their wait list was 25 years. And I was like, 25 years, just forget about it. I mean, imagine you're a single mom trying to get out of the hood. Like, just forget about it. It puts people in such a hopeless position sometimes to hear how long this wait list is. And if we can do something about it, why don't we? Right. So I want to jump into Student Homes Coalition right now. You briefly hinted at some of the policies. So Ryan, why don't you hit on first, like, what sort of policies are you working on this year? And then I'm going to come to Kate next about just general, how do you decide what to work on within student homes? So Ryan, what kind of policies are you working on this year?
Yeah. So I'll speak more broadly first in terms of kind of how we think about policies at student homes. So we have kind of more tenants' rights-based policies that we work on. You heard one of the main ones we worked on last year from Kate, AB 2801. But we generally think that students are a bit of a vulnerable population as renters. They don't often have the time or the knowledge or the finances to really be able to dig into and appreciate the leases that they're signing. You yourself spoke to the struggle of finding off-campus housing as a student. It's, if you can find something, you sign the lease and you feel happy that you found anything not an hour away from your campus. So we work on bills to try to make it more equitable for students just as renters. Then we have other bills we work on more oriented towards basic needs. So ensuring that students who are experiencing homelessness, students who are just struggling to get by, have access to the services and the resources that they need. And then I'll say the last main category, and one that we're doing a lot of work in this year, is more oriented towards new student housing development, both on campus and off campus development. And so this year, two of the main bills we're working on as the Student Homes Coalition are AB 893 and AB 357. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with legislative work, AB just stands for Assembly Bill. And then the number goes up into the thousands depending on the year you're working on. So 893 is our kind of biggest, widest reaching bill for the year. It's a bill that's going to expand a bill from a couple years ago, AB 2011, that allowed for new development on lots currently zoned for commercial use, as long as they're within half a mile of a transit stop and a few other caveats. And so what this bill said is that, while there's a lot of value in having local communities and cities decide how they want to use their land, as a state, we think we need more housing, and we definitely think we need more housing around transit stops. If you have a metro line, if you have a major bus line, that's where we want folks to be able to live. It's a lot easier for them to be able to access that public transit to get to work and all the places they need to be, rather than new greenfield development that's half an hour outside of town and not near any sort of new job opportunity. And so what we did with 893 is we said we think a lot of those arguments apply to student housing as well. We want students, we want professors, we want staff to be able to live, to work, and to learn all within, walking distance of their campus communities. And so even if a city says, we don't really want housing there, we would rather this be a target, we say as the Student Homes Coalition, there's a lot of students across the state, we actually think there should be an opportunity for new housing development, even if the lot is zoned for commercial use. And so what AB 893 does is it says as long as a developer hits a minimum number of affordable units, it's about 15% low-income units. And then they can build through a streamlined process on these commercially zoned lots within half a mile of a UC, a CSU, and a community college. And another thing we did with this bill that we try to do in all of our bills is to create new pathways for students to access those units. So in California and across the US, students are really unable to access existing deed-restricted affordable units. This is in part because units built through LIHTC or units made available through Section 8 all include clauses that say that typically full-time students under the age of 26 do not qualify for those. And I mean, this comes from, I think, a reasonable assumption that while students might have no income on paper, oftentimes they're supported by their parents. And so we don't want a student who technically has no income but has pretty wealthy parents and is getting along just fine to take up an affordable unit that someone else who's in need could use. But we also know that across the state, we have a lot of students who are really struggling. At the community colleges, about 1 in 5 students experiences homelessness in a given year. At the CSUs, that's 11% of all CSU students experience homelessness in a given year. At the UCs, that's between 4 and 8%. And so that amounts to tens of thousands of students who are experiencing homelessness in a given year in California. And so while we need to be sure that well-to-do students aren't taking up affordable units that should be used by someone else, we also need to be sure that students who are sleeping in their cars can still access these really vital resources. And so what we did with AB 893 as well is say that if a student qualifies for financial aid under existing financial aid programs, Cal Grant, Pell Grant, and Promise Grant, then they can access these low-income units.
This is really interesting. So I think I want to emphasize really quick for people there are developers that are listening right now, right? When you are able to get a streamlined process to develop these student housing units, I think people need to understand that, hey, in general, right, when you are proposing a project, looking to get your entitlements, right? Entitlements is that stamp of approval from the local city or a county to say, hey, based on your plan so far, you have our permission to build these units. But a lot of times you get a lot of community pushback, and that drives a lot of pressure on city council to say, no, my constituents don't want this project. But when you say streamline, I want to get to the exact sort of terminology, Ryan and Kate. When you talk about streamline, are you talking about, hey, if they're building student housing within a 1 mile radius or a half mile radius of a transit stop, I think that's what you said, does that mean they can build it by right as long as 50% of the units are affordable? Is that what you mean by streamline?
Yes, yeah. We mean ministerial by right review, which means the projects are no longer subject to discretionary review, nor can they be sued under CEQA. So it's a pretty significant streamlining tool to allow for units to come online and really to increase certainty for developers, because we know that the biggest killer of projects is not only like high compliance costs, right, but it's also unknown costs. And so we really want to reduce that by allowing for that ministerial by right review.
And help people understand what ministerial by right means, Kate.
Sure. So I think, like you were saying, with a lot of projects, they're subject to like open votes, right? City council votes, where there's a public hearing on a project and members of the community can come in and say, we don't like this project. We don't want construction in our neighborhood. We don't want, like Ryan was saying, low income people living around us, which are, I think, historically, that approach, while it might seem like it's democratic, it has actually just led to a really critical housing shortage across all of California, where we see more than half of Californians are rent burdened. That means that they spend over 30% of their income on rent. And over a third of Californians are severely rent burdened, meaning they spend over 50% of their income on rent. So we clearly have a crisis in this state. And we even see hundreds of thousands of people leaving for Texas and Arizona and Florida because they just cannot afford to live here, and there are not affordable units, or are not just units in general available, right? So the idea behind removing discretionary review and instituting ministerial or by right review is essentially just to say, like, if you meet these objective standards, so if you are following safety codes and law, you're on a like you're building in such a way on a parcel that is allowed by either the sort of state overlay zoning or the local zoning, that you're just allowed to build, right? You don't need to get all of these approvals. You don't need to get the city council vote, right? You're just allowed by right of owning that property. And we see this as just an essential way to sort of reduce that uncertainty and prevent a lot of these mindsets that are honestly somewhat discriminatory and anti-diversity, anti-affordability, anti-housing from sort of dominating city councils and inevitably bringing us to this place of crisis that we're in today where we just have no units and we have no affordable units.
Right. And just so people understand, just because you're getting this project approved by right, it doesn't mean you're not being safe, right? It still goes through building and safety, right? Just to
Yeah.
kind of clarify for people.
Yeah,
Okay.
so all the buildings must be up to code. They even have to abide by like standards, even more subjective standards that are sort of provided by the city or the county, depending on sort of what the relevant regulatory agency is. So they have to, of course, meet all fire safety standards, like smoke and inhalation, ventilation, everything like this. All of those standards still apply. A lot of environmental standards still apply. Even often height and density limits still apply. So those are less subjective. But it's essentially saying that if you meet all of the requirements that the city or the county has given you, or in some cases the state has given you, then you can build, right? Because as of right now, it's like, okay, first you have to meet all of these requirements, which in and of itself is a lot of work and can be incredibly expensive. But then also you have to go through this discretionary vote. And by discretionary, we essentially just mean like somewhat subjective, right? Like even if you're meeting these objective standards, you can still have city councilors vote no and kill your project just because they don't like it, right? And so what we're trying to say is that if something is meeting health standards, safety standards, and is fitting within that community plan or with that state plan, that you can build, you have a right to build there.
Yes. And I really want people to understand for this topic right here, we as developers, we struggle with what Kate referred to as unknown risk. And when you have a project that you're looking to get entitled, and let's say you took out a loan to buy a piece of land, hoping to create some more affordable housing. In this case, it could be allocated towards student housing. If that city council decides to say, you have a note right now, but it's a no right now, but maybe you go and fix some things. And all of a sudden, this approval process could take 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, maybe years. I've known friends that have taken 8 years to get projects approved. And that will kill any project if you do not have unlimited deep pockets. And that's how most projects can get killed. And I think I really want people to understand how important this work is that Kate and Ryan are doing today, because this gives so much more certainty back to the developer. Yeah, they still have to meet the safety standards, right? That's obvious. That's a must have. But they get to take away some of the political motivations behind not approving a project because you're doing the right thing. You're creating a supply of housing that's so desperately needed by the community. So I want to kind of lead this conversation now, Kate, for you to help us understand, how do you prioritize, like what sort of projects or bills that you work on, especially advocating for and lobbying? Because earlier you talked about some of the renter rights, the equality issues that students face every single day, but now you also work on like a huge bill that has tremendous ramifications for developers. So give us a little insight about how you and Ryan are thinking about prioritizing your work and thinking about what to do first versus the other, because I feel like there's like an infinite amount of options.
Yeah, for sure. I think it really all comes back to those homelessness numbers that Ryan gave just a couple minutes ago. He said 1 in 5, so 20% community college students, 11% CSU students, 4 to 8% UC students. And obviously, these numbers are honestly mind blowing, right? And so I think we want to make sure that when we're thinking about policy issues, we're making sure that we're really doing the most that we can to solve the crisis that those students are experiencing, right? And I think that when you really drill down into it, what we need to solve this crisis, particularly the student housing crisis, is more units. We need to build more units, more affordable units. We need more off-campus housing. We need more on-campus housing. We just need more housing, period. And I think this is what I'll say this is what I think students across the entire state just kind of viscerally know based on their experience of housing. I'll say in my time at the Homeless Coalition, I've been lucky to meet hundreds of students that are involved in housing policy or advocacy at their campuses. And I've met a lot of students that are experiencing homelessness or have experienced homelessness. And one thing that has really jumped out at me is that a lot of them, at least half of them, I think roughly, experience homelessness not because they couldn't afford a unit, which affordability is a huge issue, but simply because there was no housing unit available to them. So it was because their campus didn't have any available units on campus. So they went looking off campus and they couldn't find something. And so they had to sleep in their car for a while, or they moved a 2-hour bus ride away. Right. And so this really just brings us to that core issue of supply, right? We need more housing units, which is why we're pursuing policies like AB 893, which will upzone land around universities, because we know, right, college towns are specifically well suited to walkability, high density, really that just kind of cultural hub and liveliness, not just because of students, but also because of faculty and staff and folks that are sort of associated with the university in the broader sense, right? And so we want to bring that about by making or allowing, I should say, campus communities to be able to adapt to their growing populations and to their needs instead of being restricted by local zoning or NIMBY homeowners in the area that are advocating against projects, right? So I think everything comes back to that core issue, and that's where we get to our off-campus upzoning bills like AB 893 and our mixed income, so trying to bring that affordability to students. But that's also why we pursue our sort of on-campus or university development streamlining. So I think we want to make it as easy and as cheap as possible for universities and colleges to be able to build housing because they know best what the needs of their students are, right? And I'll say we've talked to the universities, we've talked to campuses, and they want to help their students. They really do. They're not trying to have 20% homelessness or 11% homelessness amongst their students. If you're a CSU, they want to be able to solve those problems, and we have to give them the tools to do so. And that often means reducing overregulation, making it cheaper to build, because a lot of those issues that you're talking about with affordable housing developers, just in the community, universities and colleges also face those same issues, that same uncertainty, long timelines, lengthy approval processes, et cetera, right? And I think just for anybody listening who is maybe wondering why they care about on-campus housing or streamlining, I'll give you two things. First is that when we have students off campus, they're contributing to overcrowding and driving up rents for everybody in an area, which is not good for the community, nor is it good for the students to be rent burdened. And number two, if you're a taxpayer here in California or really in any state where there's a state university using public funding to build housing, and the universities are wasting tens of millions of dollars on compliance costs, redesigns, delays, hiring lawyers, and just compliance consultants and everything. That's your money being wasted, right? That is state dollars being wasted to comply with other state laws or other local laws. And that just doesn't make sense to us, right? We want to make these projects as financially feasible as possible so we get the most units and the most affordability for students. But with that very long-winded answer about why we need supply side development, I will say on those other issues, those tenants issues and those student homelessness issues, we definitely understand that just because we need to build more units, that does not mean that students who are in existing units are just 100% okay, right? We see a lot of discrimination against student tenants or exploitation, right? Where landlords know, like Ryan was saying, that students don't have the resources to read and understand their lease, and they don't have the resources to fight back in small claims court. So we need to make sure that we're protecting those students that are able to access existing units. And when it comes to the immediate assistance or wraparound services for students experiencing homelessness, we 100% understand that a unit that's going to be built and completed in 3 years does not help a student that is homeless today. And we're not going to pretend like it does. So that's why we also want to pursue alternative legislative solutions to those sort of issues, right? So that pertains to advocating for more funding for student homelessness services, or allowing for greater sort of cooperation between different services to allow students that are, say, accessing a food service program or EBT or SNAP to be connected with long-term housing solutions, right? So I think we take a very holistic approach because this is such a broad crisis, right? We can't really approach such a massive student homelessness issue from just one angle, because students are experiencing it from more than one angle. So I would say that's kind of our broad philosophy.
Wow. I mean, you both are working on, and your teams are working on so much. It's such a broad, and I love that there's a long term focus on getting more supply out there, balanced with a short term focus on how do you get some help for the existing students. Ryan, anything that you would add here in terms of your priorities and some of the pushback that you expect to get for some of your advocacy work?
Yeah, I think I'll just echo everything Kate said. When you ask about what our priorities are, we definitely are walking, chewing gum, hopscotching, and a lot of other things at the same time here. Like it really is a crisis of massive scale, and so we're trying to address it from a lot of different angles. And to the question about pushback, I would say, I think folks who are familiar with the housing policy space will know that there are a lot of diverging interests in this area. Oftentimes we see people who are pro-development running up against people who see themselves as pro-tenant. And I think that the folks who are more interested in sort of basic needs and services are kind of in their whole other camp. And so one of our main priorities from a more organizing standpoint, a grassroots standpoint, is to try and bridge the interests of a lot of those communities. I mean, as Kate said, students are experiencing this crisis from a lot of different angles. And we think that groups who historically have been really interested in tenants' rights, or who historically have been really interested in pro-development, all have a place sort of under the tent of student housing advocacy and how we solve this crisis. And so one of our main priorities, aside from just working on these bills and trying to get the needle moved forward on student housing, on student basic needs, on student tenant rights, is to ensure as well that these groups can start to work together more, both on student housing and on just the housing crisis more generally. I mean, students are a major portion of the renters in California. I think not a lot of people know that there are 2 million students who attend community colleges in California.
Whoa.
That's a substantial percentage of our state's population. And so when we can do more through the community college system to provide housing for them both on and off campus, that has a lot of spillover effects just for the general housing crisis in California. So I'll say, one of the things that we've really tried to prioritize as we've moved forward with this work over the years is to not only work on these policies and try to make an impact directly, but to work with these groups as well and to kind of show them there's a way to all work together to try to help solve this issue.
Yeah. And Ryan, you shared some numbers with me in terms of like 40% of students are housed on campus. I thought it would at least be the majority, but it's not. It's not even like that. That just blew my mind. And what other stats do you think is really important for people to know about so that they can really understand the magnitude of these issues?
Absolutely. So we actually recently did a report that's up on our website, just studenthomescoalition.com. And one of the things we looked at in this report was the zoning around California's largest public universities and colleges. So we picked the 4 largest CSUs, UCs, and community colleges, and just pulled up the general plan designations for the land around them within a mile and a half to see, okay, what opportunities are there for new student housing in these areas? And I think unsurprisingly to folks who have looked at zoning policies in our cities in California, most of that land is zoned for single family use. So around our largest UCs, CSUs, and community colleges, about 50% of the land is zoned for single family, and around 15% is zoned for multifamily. And, we're not talking here about a community college with 1,500 kids in the middle of nowhere. I mean, This is UC Berkeley, UCLA. These are places where tens of thousands of students come every year to learn, to say nothing of the tens of thousands of staff and faculty who live there full time, and as well the many community members who just want to live in these vibrant, exciting cities. And so for the land around those colleges to have pretty few opportunities for multifamily development is something that we at the Homes Coalition, I think, drives a lot of our work. When we talk about AB 893 or some of these other zoning policies we're working on, what we're trying to do is sort of level the playing field here. And while we understand that in a different time, having 50% of the land around these colleges zoned for single family made sense for California, it doesn't today. And we need these universities and these college towns to be able to grow with their student populations. So that's what we're hoping to do. And then another important stat that came out of that report, one of the main things we looked at were these zoning policies. Another thing we looked at was just the cost of housing around campuses. So we looked at the off-campus housing costs around every UC, CSU, and the 15 largest community colleges. And what we found is that the cost of housing in most cases for students is actually greater than the cost of tuition. We're pretty fortunate in California to have, I think, a fairly accessible and affordable quality higher education. I had my sister and myself both went to community college here for free through something called the Promise program in California. And if you transfer from a community college to a CSU where the tuition is around $8,000 a semester, it's not cheap, but with some subsidized student loans, that's something you can work off pretty quick. Meanwhile, if you're paying $2,000 a month for rent, that's something that pretty immediately is going to limit your ability to attend an institution of higher education in the state. And so what we found is that at community colleges, the cost of housing was 7 times greater than the cost of tuition on an annual basis for students. At CSUs, the cost of housing was about double the cost of tuition. And at UCs, it's roughly equal. And so that's another stat that I think really drives our work in terms of, I know Kate mentioned at the beginning of the podcast that we both sort of started in higher education advocacy. And in the higher education advocacy space, there's a lot of folks concerned with the cost of tuition and student loan forgiveness, and a lot of these really vital issues. I don't want to minimize the impact that $8,000 a year to attend a CSU can have on a student and their family and their finances. But I think what we're trying to do here is just uplift as well, that while that remains a burden on students and a hurdle to higher education, we think that housing is an even greater burden and an even greater hurdle that oftentimes just prevents students entirely from considering following a path of higher education.
Oh, this is so good. And I loved how you kind of laid out the case there, especially with all those stats. I mean, the numbers don't lie. And Kate, I want to come to you now because as a developer, you hear about this stuff, right? I hear about the work, I hear about the need, but from incentives perspective, right? Like investors and because a lot of folks that invest in low-income housing tax credits are banks, right? A lot of developers, when they develop in California, they need to see a return on their time, their investment, which is understandable. Why should developers or investors care about student housing? What is the opportunity? What would you say to them, Kate?
Sure. I mean, I think the sort of fundamental fact, right, is that number that you said, around 40% live on campus. So something that I think is really critical about that number is that's actually just UCs. That is our biggest system. So at UCs, it's around 35 to 40% of folks live on campus. At CSUs, it's just 11%. And at community colleges, this one's the one that really shocks me. It's just 14 out of 116 campuses that have any housing at all. So there's a huge, huge, huge vacuum here. And if you're a developer or you're someone looking to finance a housing project, that is a vacuum that you can fill. And so I think is one thing that makes it really attractive is there's just incredible demand for student housing. And particularly when it comes to, I mean, really just all of our colleges and universities in the state, that's pretty stable and guaranteed income because the legislature actually here up in Sacramento year on year requires via statute that the UC and the CSU expand their enrollment, right? They say get bigger, get bigger, get bigger every single year. But there's no equivalent requirement to build more beds to allow for more students to live on campus. And there's likewise no equivalent requirement that cities upzone land to accommodate these growing student populations. So these are markets that are incredibly competitive and have incredibly high prices, and they will continue to grow with more demand being brought in just by nature of the fact that students are, constantly moving into these areas, and those student populations are constantly growing. So there's always an appetite for more density and more just rental units in general, I think is one thing. And I think something that's really interesting that we sort of see as a really critical element to university housing development that sets those public institutions apart is something that's called land use authority. So UCs and CSUs here in California, and we're really just speaking to California because that's where we work, that's where we have our expertise. But UCs and CSUs have land use authority in California. So if they own or lease a long-term lease a piece of land, they are not subject to any local zoning or any local ordinances. They can just build whatever they want on those properties, of course, subject to state safety standards. So if you're a developer and you're partnering with a university, that's a massive opportunity because say you have a parcel of land that's zoned for sort of low density residential, or even if it's multifamily, but relatively low density, low height multifamily. If you're partnering with a university on that project, you can have unlimited height, unlimited density, right? Because you're not subject to any of those local zoning standards. So that is a huge, huge opportunity for projects that maybe wouldn't have penciled under local regulations to now pencil. And you're also providing a lot more housing to a lot more students in need. And I think you can really take pride in that. And I will say, just to touch on our third sort of major bill that we're working on this year in the legislature, that's AB 648. So you'll notice that I said UCs and CSUs have land use authority. Critically, community colleges left off that list. And I think that's part of why only 14 out of 116 community colleges have housing, because it's so difficult for them to build. And I think historically, there's been this narrative around community colleges that they're commuter schools or they serve non-traditional students. So their students don't need housing. But we're seeing, as Ryan and I have both mentioned, that 20 to 25% of community college students are experiencing homelessness within a given year. So we simply cannot argue that there is no demand for student housing at community colleges. And you see when those projects are built, they're filled incredibly quickly because so many students want to have access to these. So what we're doing with AB 648 is actually expanding that land use authority that UCs and CSUs have to community colleges. So in the same way that UCs, CSUs can build whatever they want, subject to safety standards, of course, on their own land, community colleges, if this bill passes, will be able to do the same. So if you're a housing financer or a developer yourself, looking at not just partnerships with those UCs and CSUs, but also with those community colleges can really allow for just a lot more streamlined processes, less compliance costs, less uncertainty, but also just incredible opportunities for height and density and being able to deliver a lot more affordability than maybe you would be able to on a normal project.
This is so good. And I'm thinking about it from the perspective of, let's say you're an investor, let's say you own a piece of land within the designated radius of a university. This is the perfect time for you to figure out, how do you joint venture, how do you JV with a local university? Maybe it's a UC, maybe it's a CSU, but that allows you to have tremendous amount of flexibility. And when Kate talked about whether or not a deal can pencil, right? That's whether or not you can build enough units, generate enough rental income that can ultimately service the underlying debt for your project. Because a lot of times there's a lot of fixed costs, right? It costs money to put water, power, sewer into a piece of property, but those costs don't go away. But when you have more units, more density, then now you can spread those costs across a greater number of units. And I really want people to understand, like, this is the opportunity available to them right now. With all this amazing work that Kate and Ryan are doing right now, this is going to open up to so many more opportunities for you, especially as you think about, how do I contribute? How do I become and make that impact for a lot of students across the state? And Ryan, I'm going to come to you next because I want to hear from you. A lot of people might be wondering, like, okay, this is great. I love it. I'm all for this. How do they make an impact? Are they supposed to write letters to the state representatives? Are they supposed to just go out and vote? Are they supposed to sign some petitions? Like, what can people do? Give some people some ideas of what they can do, and I'm gonna have Kate kind of add in some color afterwards.
Yeah, well, I will say, we've done some work that we're proud of here at the Homes Coalition, but we're definitely still getting started. And so I know a lot of the folks who listen to this podcast are in development themselves or are investors. And so if there's anyone listening who's ever run into an issue building around a college or a university or has an idea about how we can make that easier, how we can make that more affordable and more accessible, please do shoot us an email. It's just Ryan or Kate at studenthomecoalition.org. The next legislative cycle is starting up just in a couple of months here. And so Kate and I have a lot of ideas about what we want to do next, but are always open to more. And so definitely would encourage anyone in the industry who wants to get involved or has ideas about how these processes can be made simpler to reach out. I'll say if just anyone listening as an individual is interested in helping support these policies or pro-housing policies more generally, our bills are finishing up going through the legislative cycle here. They're all in the Senate, and we've had a lot of luck so far in getting them through without having to take a lot of changes and having bills here that we think will still make a huge impact. But the next few weeks are going to be really crucial in terms of getting them across the finish line. And so as well, if anyone's interested in sending in a letter of support on behalf of their organization or just calling their elected official and telling them that they want more housing in their communities, that makes a huge difference too. So I'd say definitely reach out to Kate or myself if you want any more information on any of these bills. But honestly, just calling up your state assembly member, your state senator, saying, "Hi, my name's Ryan. I live in this city, and I just want to tell you that housing is important to me, that I want my kids to be able to live in this town, and that I know we need more housing opportunities to allow them to do so." That'll make a big difference. You don't really need to get into the policy nuances, although I'm sure a lot of people on this show could start talking about LIHTC and all the rest and provide a lot of important details. But say honestly, just calling in and saying you're a pro-housing constituent makes all the difference, because they get a lot of folks calling in saying, "Hi, my name's Ryan, and I want you to know that my number one issue is don't build anything in my city." So ensuring that we have a lot of people calling in on the other side too and talking about all the things we've been talking about here today, Kent, that housing is important and that it's what's going to make, the future of our state, both for students and for everyone, look better and brighter. It makes a huge difference.
I mean, if you're listening right now, I really hope that you understand you can make an impact, not only with your voice, your messages, but even tell your parents, tell your families to send these messages, because you need, like Ryan said, a voice that is pro-housing, because there's so much noise out there that's so anti-change, anti-housing, that's so backwards when it comes to really trying to figure out how to solve the problem and create more housing. I hope you understand. And this is the perfect time if you're developers, right? Help Kate, help Ryan understand what other implications that they might not know about. Because it was just the other day I was telling Ryan, I was like, hey, when you guys are doing this stuff, getting these projects approved by Ministerial by right, guess what? This needs to apply to utility companies. I've had friends who've had projects that were delayed 10 months, 15 months. They might have gotten the project approved, but they can't get the power out to the project. And that in turn can also kill a project, right? But it's little details like this that if you don't voice up right now, because I know students, you are some of the most fiercest advocates for some of the changes that are just transformational for this country. You are in that seat right now. So, Kate, I want to come to you next and tell us what else can people do to get involved, to make their voices heard, and to support the initiative you and Ryan are doing right now.
Sure. Yeah, I think we all need to remember that Ryan and I are not experts in housing development or finance or any of these things, right? Like, I'm still in college. Ryan graduated less than a month ago. So we, like you're saying, maybe aren't aware of all of these issues that you guys, speaking to listeners, might face on a day-to-day with housing development, right? And like Ryan said, we genuinely really do want to hear what you have to say. Like, I think we're both just curious about learning more, and we're always looking for new policy ideas and new directions that we can take or new directions that we can focus our advocacy on, right? So I would say that is a major one. Like, Ryan said, just please reach out to us. We genuinely want to learn more about sort of what issues that you're facing and how we can potentially help. A lot of our bill language actually is inspired by or comes from folks that are in a more development role, and they say, look, we really want to build this affordable project, but we can't because we have this legal barrier. Can you help us? And we try and do what we can. So I would say, yeah, just echoing everything Ryan said on that. I also think that Ryan touched on why housing advocacy can be really difficult. And it's because it's hard, right, to organize people to support a building that doesn't exist, right? Like it's hard to get folks that don't live in a place that doesn't exist to come to a city council meeting, right? But whereas on the other side, folks that currently live in an area that don't want new development, they can show out in numbers, right? Because they're there and they feel directly affected. And I think, like Ryan was saying, we need to make ourselves heard. We need to do this for each other, right? Because maybe you're not going to live in that building, or maybe no one you even know is going to live in that new affordable project, but somebody will. And that has to matter to us. And that requires us all working together. And I think we provide that opportunity as best we can for students across the state. I think something we haven't touched on at all today, but is a big part of our work, is our affiliates network, where we work with campus-based groups across the entire state. We have about 15 right now that we work with to engage in both state-level advocacy and also local advocacy. So these are campus-based political groups or pro-housing groups that we work with. But I think if you're listening to this and you're a developer, or you're even just housing curious adult, and you're like, well, I can't, not a student advocate, right? There are definitely plenty of other groups that you can get involved with. I would highly, highly encourage you to engage with any pro-housing group in your area. So any local YIMBY chapter or any just pro-housing, pro-affordability group that you can meet up with. Not only is it a great place to meet like-minded people, it's also a great place to sort of get clued into these housing issues and advocate at a local level, because as much as I feel like what we're doing is important at the state level, we can only do what we do, and our advocacy only works if there's a large grassroots network of folks around the entire state that are sort of with us and advocating at the local level, because you can also just make huge amounts of change, even just in your community. So I would really encourage folks to do that. And like I said, please reach out to us. We would love to talk to you about your experience and if there's anything we can do to help. So yeah, that's what I would say.
All right. And Kate, where can people either follow you? Do they just visit your website, studenthomescoalition.org? Can they email you directly? Tell us people how they get involved and how do they get in touch with the both of you?
Yeah, studenthomescoalition.org is our website. On there, you can find all of our information about our bills and folks that we work with, as well as our contact information. But I'll say, like Ryan said, both of our emails are, Kate at studenthomescoalition.org or Ryan at studenthomescoalition.org. So pretty easy to remember there. And then on social media, we're either Student Homes Coalition or Student Homes Co., depending on the platform. If you want to follow our work there, we sort of post more fun bill updates and sort of info on what we're doing and what our partners are doing. So we definitely have, more fun over on our socials. But yeah, please, anybody, feel free to reach out to us. Like I said, we'd love to talk to you.
All right. I love this. Guys, if you're listening to this, please make sure you follow both of them and get in touch with them. Share your insights and get involved. And Kate, Ryan, I am so grateful that both of you came onto this podcast today. We cover such an important topic. I really hope you get this bill passed where affordable housing can include full-time students. That will make a huge difference for some of the developers out there, because then it makes them feel a little bit less uncertain. And when people feel a little bit less uncertain, they're willing to take that leap of faith and have a little bit more confidence doing so. So thank you so much for both of you for what you do. Without people like you fighting for more affordable housing, I would have never had the home I grew up in. So I appreciate you both so much. Thank you so much for what you do. And I can't wait to bring you guys back on the podcast and talk about the great work that you're doing. Maybe next year, just to hear about the progress. I'm pumped. I'm excited. I'm really looking forward to seeing what the both of you do.
Well, appreciate.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you for having us on, and appreciate all the work you do to keep us all better informed and learning more about this space.
Yes, I love it. I can't wait to have both of you back. All right. And we are out.